to speak to you in your capacity as the chair of the Nile Basin. Skeptics have suggested that water is going to be the next source of conflict in Africa. What do you make of this view that we're about to see the outbreak of water wars?
Yes, thank you very much. As you have said, my name is John Rao Nyaoro. I'm the Director of Water Resources in Kenya and also the Kenyan Chief Negotiator on the Nile River Basin. With regard to the water wars within the African countries, first of all, we must be able to understand Africa has a number of rivers that the country shares. Over 50 countries, over 50 rivers are actually shared within the Africa. If you look at the Nile, it's shared by the 10 countries. If you take, for instance, Ethiopia alone, that is a part of the Nile Basin, 98% of its water resources is shared by other riparian states. And even if you look at the SADC region, the Zambezi region, how many countries share the water resources? If you look at Kenya and all that. So the talk about the water wars is about the threat being seen by the already developed countries that has already been using the water resources of these shared water resources, when the least developed countries, which are still languishing in poverty, want to start developing the same water resources. So they see a threat to this, as if they will no longer continue to get the usual shares of the water resources that they have been getting.
All right, about 9 countries have access to this Nile River water, and for many of them, the big issue is how to share the resources of the Nile equitably for their own development. Give us a sense of what's at stake here.
Yeah, if you take the Nile, actually the Nile Basin is shared by 10 rivers, not just 9 rivers. But currently, the countries that are involved in the negotiation to come up with a new cooperative framework that actually will be able to allow equitable and reasonable access to the water resources of the Nile, and also to allow a peaceful and sustainable utilization of the Nile water resources are 9. These only exclude Eritrea, which is only looking as an observer and maybe might want to come in later to join the other riparian state. The problem today, or the challenges that these states have, is that they are the upstream riparian states, and then the 2 downstream riparian states, that is Sudan and Egypt, which from all time along had been using the waters of the Nile through what we call the existing agreement. They perceived existing agreement like the 1929 agreement, actually, that gave Egypt over 38 billion cubic waters of the Nile, and Sudan over 4 billion. And then this came again, the 1959 agreement, that when the 2 countries, Egypt and Sudan, shared the entire water of the Nile among themselves, Egypt getting 55.5 billion cubic meters and Sudan getting 18.5. That actually totaled to 78 billion cubic meters of the Nile water, which has got only a total water resources of 84 billion cubic meters. That left nothing for the entire remaining 8 riparian states. This is why the riparian state decided to go and renegotiate a new cooperative agreement that will allow all the states forestall their right to have access to the waters of the Nile. This is what has been negotiated under the Nile Basin Initiative for over 13 years from 1997. And in that cooperative agreement, the states, including Egypt and Sudan, had agreed to almost all the 45 articles, except one small article talking about the water security.
Okay, you mentioned Sudan and Egypt, and very briefly, we've mentioned it earlier on. There's an upcoming referendum in Sudan, and many people are saying that throws the spanner in the works, because if Southern Sudan votes to secede, it's going to weaken significantly the leverage and the clout of Northern Sudan. And this is why recently it's been very difficult to get consensus.
You see, today we are negotiating with one Sudan as one country. But among the negotiators, I believe and I know one of them is from South Sudan. The understanding is that all of them, we should be able to steer and get a cooperative framework that will be able to help us cooperate to manage and share the water resources of the Nile. When the South Sudan become a state, definitely Nile would have given birth to another state which would also claim its shares. And South Sudan has not developed the water resources of the Nile. They would fall back and join actually the upstream states, which have also not actually developed the waters of the Nile. So that is another scenario. But I think under the new cooperative framework, they can easily accede to the new cooperative framework, and their rights can be taken on board.
Right.
But they know they also know that they will be having an obligation not to cause any significant harm to any other two downstream riparian states.
Okay, Mr. Nyaoro, please discuss with us the recently held 8th Nile Basin Trust Fund meeting. How does this trust fund work? How is it managed? And why was this meeting significant?
Yeah, the Nile Basin Trust Fund, actually under the coordination of the World Bank, was started to bring all the development partners together to help the riparian states through the Nile Basin Initiative to get the funds to be able to forge ahead with the activities of the Nile Basin Initiative, which one of them was actually to achieve a new cooperative framework. The other two were to see some tangible development within the Nile basins, where some feasibility studies would be carried if they were about the power pool, which is best countries where we can be able to develop the power, hydropower, and that power can be shared within the entire Nile basins. If we are talking about capacity building, all this, how the Nile Trust Fund came to get funds to be able to help all the riparian states. But as you know, the development partners, including the Bretton Woods institution like the World Bank, they are banks that actually trade with their money. And they would want to trade with their money with the bankable states. And so their intention is actually to have a peaceful atmosphere within the Nile Basin so that they can be able to actually lend their money to the bankable state, which are at peace and will be able to go about their business and utilize their fund sustainably.
All right, thanks so much. Let's bring in the views of our guest host, Nyagaka Ongeri. Monetary assistance and conditions attached in order that all the 9 countries that find themselves within this water pool can develop their economies utilizing the water of the Nile. What do you make of that in terms of a funding model?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely needed. And, you know, it's interesting that, that the World Bank scenario is actually brought forward, because I think absent international assistance, it's very difficult to actually see the building of, for example, generation plants in Ethiopia, or the building of hydroelectric plants in Uganda as well. So it is a huge issue.
I think you raised an interesting one here, and I know you travel extensively. When Kenya was having an electricity crisis because they had a drought, Ethiopia was in a position to supply them with an incredible amount of electricity at an affordable rate. Now, I don't know whether Ethiopia generates electricity from water, but if one was to assume so, then in itself that creates a bit of a contentious issue, because the water is being used to provide a much needed energy source that others should ordinarily have access to, because they all have access to the Nile. And these are some of the questions about equitable usage of water. When we look at the development components of Africa, what should the approach be to this situation?
Well, Large, I think you've actually hit the nail on the head, because I think a lot of people focus on food security when it comes to the Nile Basin, but a huge issue is actually energy security. You know, Ethiopia, as you mentioned, is actually building a huge hydroelectric power project on, I think it's the Blue Nile Basin as well. So energy security, I think, is just as contentious as food security is, and is a huge issue.
Mr. Nyaoro, just your views on this one. A lot of the countries within the basin are facing the same challenges of overcoming poverty, of managing population growth, food security and better agricultural production, but also energy security and making sure that their economies start to industrialize with a consistent supply of electricity, which could come from the Nile. How to resolve all these incredible challenges for these 9 states?
Yeah, actually that is one of the reasons actually why the riparian state wanted to renegotiate a new agreement that will be able to allow them to develop and have access to the water resources of the Nile. Some of the Nile, like if I take for our country, Kenya, we contribute about 12 billion cubic meters to the Lake Victoria that all finds its way to the White Nile and finally to the Blue Nile. We use less than 1 billion. So we are saying, and we know, being a development countries, we would require loans or grants from the Bretton Woods institutions like the World Bank. The World Bank OP 7.5 operation policy states very clear for a state to utilize the resources of the World Bank to develop a shared water resources, they must get a consent from the other riparian state. And this has been the bottleneck. There is no way how you can be able to get a favorable consent if you don't have an agreement that gives you your rights and your obligations. You don't know to what extent can you be able to develop the water resources of these shared water resources. So if you have an agreement, as we have already developed in the cooperative framework, that will give all the riparian states their equitable allocation. So if Kenya is allocated 4 billion, Kenya know very well we can develop up to 4 billion. We can go to the bank. Look, we have been allocated 4 billion. That is our equitable shares. Give us loan to develop even 1 billion or 2 billion, which are not going to cause any significant harm to any riparian state. So that is the only scenario that will get all these, the Nile Basin countries to get out of poverty, because water has got economic value. Water will be able to give them economic empowerment. They will be able to do it. If you look at even Egypt, their economic power comes from the Nile because of the use of the water of the Nile. If it happens to other riparian state, the other riparian state will also be at peace and will be able to develop and build their economy.